Hey guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bass, and today we're talking about where bass go in the heart of winter. During that coldest time period, where do those fish settle? In Highland reservoirs, Lowland reservoirs, in ponds, in rivers. Where should you look for those fish? And then we'll talk about how to catch them as well. Once you understand the movements of winter bass, winter fishing is incredible. The fish are very consistent, they're very predictable, and they're not very hard to catch. Plus, you're generally alone on the lake. It's a great time to be on the water. But for the person who's never done it, fishing in the winter time is a mystery. The fish behave differently, they're not in the same places, and it can be incredibly frustrating, especially if you're out there freezing cold. So understanding where these fish go and how they position before you even get to the lake is a huge win for you as an angler. At the end of this, we'll talk a little bit about some of our favorite baits. We're gonna glaze right by all that right now. And we're gonna focus on where these fish go in different types of fisheries so that you have a starting point. Let's kick it off. Let me think, which one should we? Well, you know what? Let's just kick it off with the pond guy. I think that's a fantastic place to start. So we're gonna talk ponds, then let's talk about Highland reservoirs versus Lowland reservoirs. Natural lakes, really natural lakes and ponds go together, and then maybe a little bit about, rivers or current fisheries as well. So the pond guy, and also the guy who's in a natural lake, so a place that doesn't have a dam, typically these will behave very, very similarly. If you're a pond fisherman and you're out there trying to catch those bass in winter, it can be frustrating, especially if that pond is shallow. There are some key things that I want you to be thinking about as we go through the coldest part of winter. You know those bass are in there, and they still need to eat. They don't have to eat as much, but they still need to eat, so you can catch these fish. The beauty of winter is your odds have actually gone up of catching a giant fish. So where do they position? First, you need to establish what kind of pond you're in. If you are in a small natural pond, so no dam or slower contours, or even if it is a pond with a dam, if it's slow contours, fairly shallow, that's one type. If it's steep and deep, so you got a small dam that's really tall, you got deep water behind it, that's actually going to behave more like a Highland reservoir, just a miniature version of it. But if your pond is steep and deep, this is super easy. Your fish will do one of two things. They're going to head to the deepest water in the pond, typically sitting just off of the dam itself. Even if that water is, 40, 50, 60 feet deep, they can go out there and sit right on the bottom, right in front of that dam. If they want to feed, they can move up on that rock face to feed, and they can go right back out. Or if it's concrete, they can pull up on that concrete. But most of them will sit right there in the deepest water where they are most insulated from changing conditions. Now, the other place that you're going to see them is in sort of the gut. So depending on the size of the pond, it might have a couple of little arms, it might not, might just taper out in the back. But the gut back there where that thing's tapering out, typically fish will sit right in the belly of a cove. So like, see where we're sitting here? Now granted, we're on a giant lake, but we're in a cove. See the shape of this cove? It's sort of a bowl between these two shorelines. That is the gut, or the hollow. So the fish will, in the springtime, they'll be way back in there. They're back there in the fall, chasing bait fish, eating shallow. Soon as it starts getting cold, the colder and colder it gets, the farther out they'll back out, but they'll typically go right down the hollow or right down the gut. And they'll only go as far as they have to get insulated from the conditions. So if you are mobile, if you're in a little tin boat or something, it pays not only to fish right down at the dam, but also to work your way up that gut and see if you could find a second grouping of fish. And then the third thing will be if there is hard cover in that place. They will pull right to that hard cover. You know, if there's a brush pile, if there's a rocky outcrop, if there's a laid down tree, they'll be out at the tip of that tree. They'll be on those obvious places too. Now for the guy whose pond either is very little contour, so it's very shallow, or it just doesn't have a lot going on, not a lot of hard cover, depth is key. Those fish will pull to the deepest available water. Now that water might only be 5 feet deep on some shallow pond in the south. It might be 25 feet deep in the next pond, but they'll pull to that deepest water location, and it might be close to a shoreline or it might be the dead center of that pond. It just depends on the pond, but they'll pull to the dead center even if there is not cover. And I think that's what people miss. Guys want to fish the things they can see, right? But these fish, if there's cover out in the middle, they're on that cover. But if there's nothing out there, they have no problem pulling to that deeper, lower spot and just sitting in the mud. The bass aren't the only fish doing it. The bait fish are out there too. The bluegill, the crappie, the catfish. They're there together, so there's still plenty for them to feed on, even just sitting on a flat mud bottom, insulating themselves away from the surface. So pond fishing truly is simple. You want to fish the deepest water in the pond, then you want to check that closer deep water for where those fish might be creeping and they're just sort of insulating themselves. And then you want to check isolated cover if you have it. If it's something like a laydown, try the very farthest out bottom, deepest part of it first, then work your way up, because these fish will be consistent with depth. If you catch them on the end of one laydown, they're probably on the end of any other laydowns you have. If you only have one laydown, well, it was still good information. Now, let's shift away from ponds. Let's talk Highland reservoirs, one of my favorite places to fish in the wintertime. And Highland reservoirs, it's all about high percentage areas. And we've talked about this in a bunch of recent videos. What I mean by high percentage areas is fish are going to pull to places that are pretty obvious. If you've got different creek arms, where those arms come together, the point where they come together is a fantastic place to check, especially if that point has good rock on it. Good rock can be fist-sized chunk rock. It can be enormous boulders the size of the boat. But bass just tend to be around rock if it's an option. Another place, different arms coming together. If there's not a perfect point between them, but if a place narrows down, like a pinch point, I'll fish if there's points on either side of a pinch point where the lake narrows. I'll fish both points. But even if they're just walls, right there where it's the narrowest, both sides can be very, very good. If one has more rock than the other, or one's barren and one has cover, start with the one that has cover. Now, keep in mind, in a big fishery, there will still be fish pushing hollows into the backs of coves, into the backs of guts. There'll be fish down by the dam. There'll be a lot of places, but these are the places where the fish are easily targetable, where you can look at a map and quickly identify here, there, there. And when you go there, it's very likely the fish will be on those spots and you can catch them. So there are other places, but these are places that can be patterned very quickly. These are the places that I'm looking for when I'm going to a new lake. And then again, those hollows, same thing I just described. If you've got a long arm, it's one thing if that arm comes out fast to the main lake, right? Steep and deep, just drops off. But if it's a slow taper, like you've got a creek arm that's had a lot of sediment come into it through the years, so it's a very slow taper. You move a quarter mile and it's gotten 5 feet deeper. It's very hard to gauge where those fish are, but it's all about depth. If you discover, as you idle out that hollow, all of a sudden you run over some fish and some bait at 25 feet, you can go to the next one, the next one, the next one, and all you have to do is check that 25-foot mark. You don't have to go back up shallow. These fish are very consistent about the depths that they have chosen. So regardless of what that depth is, whether it's 25 or 45, whatever it is when you run into them, stick to that and try and mirror it in similar places. You'll be surprised how predictable that is. And then the last place I love to look is if there's flats on your lake, shallower areas where those run out, eventually they should break to deep water. Either you hit an old creek channel, or they just plain taper out. Wherever they start to break off is a place that I spend a lot of time. And the reason why is that the rest of the year, the fish can be all over those flats. Maybe there's grass growing up there, or maybe it's just good shallow water. But as that water gets cold and those fish pull out, that break is the first place that's going to stop them. So you might have fish from 100 acres of water up on the giant flat that will now line up on a single drop off. So there are more fish on that spot than there would normally be. So they tend to school together and you can get on a really good bite. In fact, we did that in a recent fishing video, throwing that jig, catching a lot of fish where points were running out and breaking off to deep water. It's, again, very predictable. It's just clockwork. Now, lowland reservoirs, that can be a little bit more of a bear. You know, a lowland reservoir's typically got a wider dam on it, might have more than one dam. You can have a lot of contours in a lake like that, a lot of humps, a lot of long points, meandering creek channels, possibly more than one meandering creek channel. It's not like there's a river channel plowed through the lake. Oftentimes you'll have different arms coming in that tie in together out in the middle. There's just so many places for fish to hide in those. You want to check edges of island tops. Essentially, the first thing I'll do is I'll go closest to the dam. And the reason why I do that, on any lake that has a dam, the dam is the farthest from the incoming creeks. So if there's a river arm dumping in, or 20 river arms, depending on the size of the lake, the closer you are to the rivers, the more impacted they will be by storms. So you'll have muddy water, then clean water, muddy water, clean water. The closer you get to the dam on any lake, the farther you are from all that activity. So it's just more stable. Even if it gets muddy last. The water tends to be less muddy. It just is less impacted all the way around. So oftentimes if I want to check a new fishery, I'll go down to the dam and I'll look for the first good creek arm near that dam, and I'll look around there. And that's just sort of how I start gauging what the lake is doing before I branch out to places that are less stable. But I'm looking, much like a Highland reservoir, I'm looking for ends of long points. I'm looking for breaks that break to deep water. You tend to have a lot more humps in those lowland reservoirs. So I'll check the sides of humps. Humps that have cover on them are so much better than humps that are just completely bald. So if you're idling around in your boat, you know, side imaging, and one hump has nothing on it, the next hump's got rock, the next hump has trees, it's pretty obvious they're gonna be in that cover. They're not gonna be on the barren ones. But if you're in a lake that just has nothing in it, it's just, some lakes are just like that. It's like the surface of the moon out there. Then it's all about contour at that point. So even bald humps where that thing breaks off, they'll be sitting right on that edge. And you can tell a lot by a fish's mood about how they position in a place like that where there's a drop off, whether that's a hump or the end of a flat or a long tapering point. If they're at the top of the break, those fish tend to want to feed. Fish that are at the bottom of the break tend to be shut down because they tend to move up when they want to feed, and then they move down when they sort of want to insulate themselves and just sit around. But again, those are all great places to look. You can also check the big hollows on fisheries like that. So contour lines again become critical. You know, I think of a place like Clear Lake where Tim and I came from, and one end of Clear Lake is very predictable. The other end's a giant bowl. Well, out there in that giant bowl, it takes miles, literal miles, for there to be any significant transition, just to gain a few feet of transition. So in a place like that, those fish are still out there, but they are so specific on depth. If you find them at 8.5 feet, I mean, they are at 8.5 feet everywhere. And if you can find any transition, if you can find a single piece of brush that somehow got out there, if you can find a little stick that blew in and sunk, if you find a rock out there or a tire that somehow drifted off of a dock, if it's at the right depth, those fish will pile on those things. I mean, you can have dozens of fish sit around a single tire on the bottom because it's at the right depth and there's nothing else. It's fascinating how they'll just latch to a piece of cover like that. And then last, Guys that are fishing current, whether that's in a river, whether that's a tidal fishery, there's lots of places where there are current. The biggest thing I can say about current, again, you'll have fish in a lot of different places. The fish that are most easy to catch are the fish that insulate themselves away from the current. So if you've got a river with a little offshoot that comes in and that offshoot has a lot less current, they'll tend to pull into that offshoot, or they'll sit right there at that connection where those two come together. In a place that has nothing like that, if you've got rapids and then pools, rapids, pools, they'll sit down in those pools completely away from the current. California Delta, I'm looking for those backwaters where the tide is passing by them. Of course, they're still pulling out and going back, of course, but those places that have less current. One of my favorite places in something like the Delta, whether it's California Delta or any other Delta, if you can find a slough where the water is being drawn out at both ends. So on an outgoing tide, it's coming out both ends of the slough. On an incoming tide, it's coming in both ends of the slough. Well, the water in the dead center of that slough is effectively not moving at all. It's just going up and down, right? Because current's going out both ways. So the middle just rises and falls. You'd be shocked the number of giant fish that will glue themselves in a little place like that because they're essentially living in a lake in the middle of a river. There's no current. So fish will find those places with low current, but even just a little eddy on a, if a river comes in, swings a corner and there's an eddy behind it, they're going to sit in that. And if they want to feed, they'll move up to feed. But if they don't, they just move down and they just park on the bottom. It's a really fun time of year, primarily because if you find fish in any of the places that I've described, any of them, those fish, unless something major happens, giant storm, the lake rises with chocolate milk water, or they suddenly drop the lake, they choose to release water out of it. Huge changes in water depth will make fish move. Huge swings in temperature. A giant warm up or a giant cool down will make fish move. But other than that, if you're just going through the paces of a normal winter and your weather is about the same with reasonable swings in it, once you've found fish, they're going nowhere. You can catch them week after week after week after week on the exact same places, doing the exact same things. And it will also let you fine tune it because you can find them with a tactical DD. In fact, this is a great time to transition to baits, but you can find them on the crankbait, then you can come back. They don't want the crankbait, you could try them on a jerkbait. You could try them on a blade bait, a spoon, a jig, whatever it might be. You can finesse them, but you get into this game where you know where your fish are now. If you're standing on the bank and you're fishing across the face of that dam and you catch them a third of the way across the dam every time, now you know where they are. Now you can play with some baits. You can try and fine tune it, see if you can catch more or bigger fish. Now, as far as baits go, I'm not going to go deep down that rabbit hole. I will link all of them in the video description for you. The other thing I'm going to do is link some very specific budget rods for you guys. We just wrapped up the buyer's guide series, so we won't take a deep dive there, but I'll link some key budget rods for some of these key patterns that we use because not all inexpensive rods are created equal. So we'll pick out some gems for the different techniques and we'll link those in the description too. But I'm not going to beat the dead horse on speed cranking. You guys have heard us talk about it a ton, but speed cranking is one of the best ways to cover water and find those fish. The blade bait is another amazing option where you're bottom hopping to get those lethargic fish to bite. It's staying right in their zone. It's in their face. They react to it really well. The jerk bait is another phenomenal choice. This one in particular, that Vision 110 Junior +1, so that deeper diving bill. That, if I could only have one, it's that bait right now. That's just a bait that you can fish super slow. I can let it pause as long as 10 seconds between twitches, and I'm just able to really finesse those fish. When you slow that jerkbait down and you work it and then just sit, what'll happen is you work over the top of those fish. If you keep ripping, they never even come to it. But if you pause, that gives them time to rise to it because they're typically not moving fast. They'll rise to it, and then if they get close enough that they're in the strike zone, the next time you make a move, then they pounce. Of course, the tiny swim bait will always be a player this time of year. The A-rig's a major deal. You guys probably saw, if you missed it, we just launched this guy. We launched our micro rig. So we partnered with Hog Farmer a few years ago to create this, the tactical flex rig. See how flexible it is? Shortly thereafter, we came out with the mini flex because bites were getting tougher around the country. And now that micro flex, where you truly can throw a 2.8 Kitech or a 3-inch swim bait, and it's designed specifically for those smaller baits, specifically for tough conditions. But again, all three sizes of rig, it depends on your lake. Are you on a crystal clear Highland reservoir where they don't want to feed heavily? Well, you go down to the smaller stuff. Are you on a lake where there's giants and they're chasing gizzard shad? You throw the bigger stuff. It's that simple. And then finally, that brings us to the jig, which is a major player for me. That's a finesse football jig, is my favorite, with a double tail grub on it. That's what I trust all through the winter. It's just such a proven bait. And then if I had to pick one finesse bait, for me it's a Ned rig. For Tim, it would be a drop shot. And I'll link a couple of our favorites for that as well. Even when you're an advanced angler, different guys have a little bit different style, little bit different confidence. I know for sure Tim would reach for that drop shot at the same time I would reach for that Ned rig. It's just confidence. But these are very consistent baits. Anytime I show up somewhere and I don't know what's going on, this is literally the arsenal that I will have tied on. Those are the baits that I experiment with, and I just work my way through them until I find some fish that want to bite, and then I try and adapt. I try different baits, and then I try to mirror that location around the lake or the pond that I'm fishing to try to get it to repeat. Once I have a pattern, I have more than one place doing the same thing, now I know exactly what I'm looking for, and I can run that all over the place, and I can do that all winter long. Guys, I hope this helps you. Winter is truly an amazing time to be on the water. You don't want to miss it. Being out on a quiet lake, catching fish on a cold morning with nobody around you is special. It's like fishing on a private lake. It's really a neat experience. Plus, you can catch giants. Again, I hope this helped you. If it did, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll talk to you soon.